Hello, I'm Joe Walensky, and I want to talk about some user assistance techniques used on a web service website that I use called Ancestry.com. And so I'll just go through a few of the things that I like about this particular site. The Ancestry.com, if you're not familiar with it, does genealogical studies, so family trees and things like that. And it's relatively simple to use, but there are also there's a lot of depth to it, and there's a lot of features that you can get into. And so one of the things that I like about this part, the way the user assistance is done for this product, is that it's a very comprehensive solution. So it comes at help from a lot of different directions, provides help in a lot of different ways for different types of activities that you may be involved with. And that's been one of my themes over the past few years when I talk to groups about user assistance, is the idea of just thinking about doing things in a number of different ways, recognizing that different people like to learn in different ways, different things should be presented in different ways, and kind of get off the safe spot of just having a traditional help system and a PDF file. So let me jump into some of the items here that I wanted to look at. First of all, as with any software product, there's screens where you'll type things into forms. One of the things that I like about it is that in the product, in the Hitlines, they often will provide very helpful Hitlines. Oh, sorry about that. Let's switch over. To get my magnifier out. And go over here. It's kind of hard to see without the magnifier. But for example, in the last name field, if I go to the last name field, the hint line under it says for women use a maiden name. And that's important for this product. That actually makes it easier for the service to be able to find related people by having a maiden name as opposed to a woman's married name. And so here the hint line is, a lot of times people say, well, with the last name, what do you really need to have a hint about? It's the last name. And well, it can be useful to provide examples when something like that can make a difference. Another example in birth date, down a little farther on the form. So here they list the way to put in the date with the day, the month, and the year, and that's pretty standard to do that. Although with the product, technically you could put it in a lot of different ways, and so this is just a hint. But then the part where it says about 1885, that's important because that's a good way of putting in a year, a birth date, if you're not really sure what all of it is. So if you use that keyword about, that will give it a little bit more flexibility in finding information. Now another thing that they have on this form is some drop-down information. So for example, here when you're starting another family tree, the checkbox I'm starting with myself, why do we ask is a drop-down pop-up that provides a little bit more detail about that. And then the last thing that's nice about it is that there is a sequence of information to present, and it provides breadcrumbs up at the top for the steps to be able to start that tree. And that just helps people that are new to the process to understand what happens next. In the actual getting into the actual help system itself, the entrance point to the help, I think it's kind of interesting because it uses a format that's not a traditional table of contents. And I think that works, especially with a lot of web properties. It makes sense to users if the way that you present the help looks like the rest of the app. And in this case, it does that. Let me just switch over to web version, live web version of it. And so if I go to get help or go through the Learning Center, it'll bring me to this page called Help Categories. If I select on one of the help categories, then I can get additional information. So essentially, the icons that are up at the top are your top level to the hierarchy. Then you choose a topic, and so for example, I'll choose ending your subscription, and then it brings up the articles that are related to that. Even using the word article, I think, is kind of interesting, a different way to present that. And then once you get to this section, you can go to the actual help topics. And the help topics are all well done, but they're fairly standard, so I don't think there's anything particularly interesting here, except that they just do a good job of that. One thing that I think is useful, an interesting addition, is their use of the share buttons, share options right at the top. And so if I click on share, it brings me to the different community areas that I might want to share to. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Going back to the slides, I mentioned that it has different kinds of information for different people, and if you go to the Learning Center, there's all kinds of information that are provided to help with the product. And obviously with a research product like this, it makes sense that they have a lot of information available. But if your product is something that is complex, there's a lot of different aspects to it, I think a portal like this is much more attractive and engaging to customers than a traditional hierarchical table of contents. This just makes it seem more interesting to be able to get into the different pieces of information that are available. Another navigation element that they have, which is on the main page of the Learning Center, are these two areas. One called Most Popular Help Articles. So essentially, this is like a frequently asked questions page, but it's, I think, a little bit. I think it's done in maybe a way that's a little bit easier to process for customers. A lot of frequently asked question pages are framed in the way that the people doing the support think that you want to ask the question. This doesn't really present it that way. It's more just showing the help articles that have been most popular and assuming that then that's going to be, provide value just by having it there the way it is. And there's also a area on community posts, which are interesting in and of themselves because they have a really good user community, and so there's a lot of information on the wiki part of the site of people adding helpful information for others to find. And then there's sections that get into a lot of detail about working with different parts of genealogical searches. For example, this one is specifically related to a census search, and these are written in a magazine style format. So they do have screen captures in them, and they do refer to procedures, but it's really more about telling a story of how to get a little farther with your family tree, beginning, a middle, and an end. In addition to that, they have videos that are presentations by people who are experts in working with family trees, and so that's a nice supplement to have. Those are all posted on YouTube, but then they're embedded directly into the Ancestry.com user interface as a library of videos that are available. And they're always presenting different little touches throughout the site to make sure that you're aware of doing that. So for example, on this screen, the start button with the Watch Now, researchers help you find your immigrant tools, that would take you directly to the set of videos. I mentioned that they do a lot with social media, and so they have a page on Facebook that links you to information that you might be interested in. The Google Plus page is interesting because that has that lists posts that Ancestry.com is making about certain issues that come up related to questions people have, new features, things like that. And then they also have a YouTube channel, and that's where you can go to find all of the different videos that have been made available. So that's kind of the nickel tour of what's going on in Ancestry.com. I just thought I would present that to you, and hopefully you'll be able to use some of that as food for thought for your own design projects. Thanks a lot.